My parents told me I was no longer their daughter 3 days after my 13th birthday, standing in the doorway of the only home I'd ever known while my grandmother's old suitcase sat packed on the porch behind them, like they'd planned the exact moment for maximum efficiency. The reason, if you could even call it that, fit into a single sentence. I told them I was gay. I hadn't even meant to say it out loud that particular afternoon. It slipped out during an argument about a school dance, a stupid, ordinary argument about curfew, and who I'd be going with when I mentioned, almost as an aside, that I liked a girl named Marisol from my English class. I remember the exact moment the words left my mouth. Remember the way the kitchen went quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Remember watching my mother's hand freeze mid-motion as she reached for a dish towel. My father set down the newspaper he'd been reading, folded it with unnerving precision, and looked at me for a long moment before saying, very quietly, that he wasn't going to raise a child who'd chosen that path. He said it the way you might discuss a disappointing college major, like I'd announced I was dropping out of pre-med to study something impractical, not like I'd just told him something essential and unchangeable about who I was. I remember trying to explain, my 13-year-old voice cracking with a panic I didn't fully understand yet, that I hadn't chosen anything, that this was just who I'd always been, that I didn't understand what was happening or why the room suddenly felt like it was closing in around me. My mother didn't say anything at all that first night. She simply left the room, and I heard her and my father talking in low, urgent voices behind their closed bedroom door for over an hour while I sat frozen on the couch, not understanding yet that I was, in that very moment, being erased from my own family in real time. 3 days later, they told me to pack. Not gently, not with any explanation beyond what had already been said. My father informed me, in the same flat, business-like tone he might have used to announce a change in dinner plans, that my Aunt Rosalind, my mother's older sister, a woman I'd only met a handful of times at holidays, had agreed to take me in. He said it like he was arranging a logistical handoff rather than discarding his own child, like I was a piece of furniture being relocated to someone else's house because it no longer fit the decor. I remember standing in that doorway, my grandmother's old floral suitcase already packed by someone else's hands, a duffel bag stuffed haphazardly with clothes I hadn't chosen, feeling the full, dizzying weight of what was happening settle into my chest all at once. I begged. I actually begged, 13 years old and sobbing, asking where I was supposed to go, what I'd done that was so unforgivable, whether they'd ever change their minds if I just didn't tell anyone, if I just pretended none of it had ever happened. My father's expression didn't change. My mother stood slightly behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, her eyes fixed somewhere over my shoulder, refusing to look directly at me, as if avoiding my gaze might somehow make what she was allowing happen less real, less her fault. Rosalind met me at her door that night, without a single question. She took one look at my tear-streaked face and the suitcase in my hand, and simply stepped aside to let me in, her expression unreadable in a way I didn't understand until years later. Not pity exactly, but something like grim, focused resolve, the look of someone who'd half expected this call for years and had simply been waiting, dreading, for the day it finally came. She made up the guest room without asking me anything about what had happened. She handed me a mug of hot chocolate I couldn't bring myself to drink, and she sat with me in silence on her couch until I eventually cried myself into an exhausted, hollow kind of sleep, still in my school clothes from that morning, back when I still had parents who claimed me. I learned, slowly, over the weeks that followed, that Rosalind had been estranged from my mother for years over disagreements about exactly this kind of thing. My mother's rigid adherence to my father's worldview, Rosalind's quiet disapproval of it, tensions that had apparently simmered between the sisters long before I was ever born into the middle of it. Rosalind never spoke badly about my parents in front of me, not once, not even when I was old enough to ask her directly what she thought of what they'd done. She simply said every time that some people build their whole identity around being right, and that the cost of admitting they'd been wrong feels, to them, more unbearable than losing the people they'd wronged in the first place. Over the years that followed, Rosalind became more of a parent to me than either of the people who'd raised me for 13 years combined. She sat through parent-teacher conferences where teachers gently, awkwardly asked about Mom and Dad, and she simply said, calmly, that she was my guardian, without offering further explanation unless someone pressed. She helped me fill out college applications at the kitchen table late into the night, celebrated my acceptance letters like they were her own accomplishments, sat in the front row at my college graduation clapping so hard and so loudly I could hear her over everyone else in the auditorium. She met every partner I ever brought home, awkward high school crushes, a college girlfriend who didn't last, and eventually Sophia, with genuine warmth instead of quiet, tight-lipped judgment, the exact opposite of what I'd grown up expecting from the adults who were supposed to love me unconditionally. My actual parents, meanwhile, existed at the edges of my life like a persistent rumor rather than an active presence. Occasional secondhand updates trickled through relatives at holiday gatherings I sometimes attended and sometimes didn't. My father had gotten a promotion. My mother had started gardening, small, meaningless fragments of a life I was no longer part of. Some years a Christmas card arrived, signed simply Mom and Dad. No note, no acknowledgement of anything that had happened, as if the card itself was meant to paper over a wound instead of address it. Other years, nothing came at all. No birthday calls, not once in 15 years. No congratulations when I graduated, no acknowledgement when I got my first job as a physical therapist. Nothing when Sophia and I got married in a small ceremony in Rosalind's backyard. The string lights her husband had strung up years earlier still hanging in the trees above us like they'd been waiting for exactly this occasion. I stopped expecting anything from my parents somewhere around my sophomore year of college, the specific moment crystallizing after a birthday passed without a single word from either of them for the 5th year running. Once I fully let go of the expectation, the absence hurt less, though it never disappeared completely. It simply settled into something quieter, a low, persistent ache I learned to carry rather than something that could knock the wind out of me on any given ordinary day. I built an entire life without them. I became a physical therapist, work I loved and was good at, work that let me help people rebuild movement and independence after injuries that had upended their lives, something about the process of careful, patient rebuilding that felt meaningful to me in ways I never examined too closely. I married Sophia, a woman who made me laugh so hard I sometimes genuinely couldn't breathe, who understood without needing lengthy explanation why certain holidays felt complicated for me, who never once suggested I should try harder to reconcile with people who'd shown me exactly who they were the day they packed my suitcase. We bought a small house together with a garden I was slowly, imperfectly learning to keep alive, despite what Sophia affectionately called my complete absence of any natural gardening talent. 15 years passed this way, my parents becoming smaller and smaller figures in the rearview mirror of a life I'd built entirely without them, until they were little more than a story I told carefully, occasionally, to new friends who needed context for why I flinched slightly at questions about family Thanksgivings. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon 2 months ago, in the middle of an entirely unremarkable workday, I got a phone call informing me that my father had died suddenly of a heart attack the previous evening, and that the reading of his will had been scheduled for the following week. I almost didn't answer the phone that Tuesday. It was an unfamiliar number, the kind I usually let go to voicemail during work hours, but something made me pick it up between patients, my hand hovering over the decline button for just a second too long before I swiped to accept. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself as a paralegal at a law office I didn't recognize, her tone practiced and gentle in the specific way people learn to deliver bad news for a living. She asked if she was speaking with the daughter of the deceased, and I remember the word, daughter, landing strangely in my ears, a label I hadn't heard applied to myself in connection with that family in 15 years. She explained that my father had passed away the previous evening from a sudden cardiac event, that the family had been notified, and that as a named party in his will, I was being formally invited to attend the reading the following Thursday. I sat there in the break room afterward, phone still in my hand, feeling absolutely nothing for the first several seconds, and then feeling everything all at once. Grief I didn't expect and didn't feel entitled to, relief I felt immediately ashamed of, and beneath both of those, a confusion so total it left me unable to finish my shift without excusing myself early, something I'd never done in 8 years of working there. Sophia found me on the couch that evening still wearing my scrubs, staring at nothing, and once I managed to explain what had happened, She sat down beside me and simply held my hand for a long time before asking anything at all. When she finally spoke, she asked gently whether I even wanted to go, whether there was some part of me that needed this kind of closure badly enough to sit in a room with people who'd erased me from their lives without a second thought 15 years earlier. I didn't have an answer for her that first night. I spent the next several days turning the question over obsessively, unable to settle on what I actually felt or wanted. Part of me wanted to ignore the invitation entirely, to let my father's death pass the way his life had passed for me over the last decade and a half, at a distance, secondhand, irrelevant. But another part of me, a part one didn't fully trust or understand, kept circling back to something that felt less like grief and more like unfinished business, a need to see this particular chapter through to its actual, factual conclusion instead of letting it remain permanently unresolved in the back of my mind. Rosalind, when I called her, was quieter than I expected. She'd maintained a careful, distant politeness with her sister over the years, enough to stay informed about family developments without actually being close to any of it, and she told me she'd heard about my father's death through a mutual cousin the day before I had. She didn't tell me what to do. She simply said that whatever I decided, she'd support it, and that I didn't owe anyone in that family a single ounce of my presence if I didn't want to give it. In the end, I decided to go, not for my father, and not even really for myself in any sentimental sense I could clearly name. I went because I needed to see this through, because some stubborn, practical part of me refused to let this remain an open question I'd wonder about for the rest of my life. Sophia offered to come with me, but I asked her to wait in the car outside instead. Some instinct told me I needed to face this particular room alone, on my own terms, without anyone watching me while I figured out how to hold myself together. The law office was smaller than I expected, tucked into a converted house on a quiet street, the kind of place that handled small-town estates rather than anything glamorous. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in my car for most of that time, watching a handful of relatives I vaguely recognized filter in through the front door, an uncle I hadn't seen since childhood, a cousin now visibly middle-aged where I remembered her as a teenager, none of them acknowledging me directly as I finally made myself walk inside and take a seat near the back of the small conference room. The reading began without my mother. I remember noting her absence with a strange mixture of relief and unease, wondering whether she'd simply chosen not to come, whether facing me in a room after 15 years of silence had felt like more than she could manage. The lawyer, a calm, measured man named Mr. Whitfield, who introduced himself briefly before getting started, began working through the will's opening sections, small procedural language, confirmation of my father's identity, the standard formalities that precede the actual substance of these documents. 7 minutes in, the door burst open. My mother stood in the doorway, breathless, her coat still half-buttoned, clearly having rushed across town in a way that suggested she'd either arrived late by accident or had deliberately timed her entrance to feel like an event. The room went silent, every head turning toward her at once, and I felt my whole body go rigid as I watched her scan the room and demand to know, loudly, why the lawyer had started without her. I hadn't seen my mother in person in 15 years. She looked older than I'd braced myself for, smaller somehow, the sharp, cold edges I remembered from childhood softened by time into something that almost looked fragile, though I reminded myself immediately not to let that appearance fool me into forgetting who she actually was and what she'd allowed to happen to me. Mr. Whitfield, entirely unbothered, gestured toward an empty chair and informed her, without any particular urgency, that the reading would continue as scheduled regardless of her arrival time. My mother's eyes swept the room as she lowered herself into the seat, and when they landed on me, sitting quietly near the back, something flickered across her face. Recognition first, unmistakable, followed immediately by something harder to name, something that hovered uncomfortably between guilt and rapid calculation, like she was doing quick, silent math behind her eyes about what my presence in that room might mean. I didn't say anything. I folded my hands in my lap, kept my expression as neutral as I could manage, and waited to hear whatever my father, a man who'd told me at 13 that I wasn't his daughter anymore, had ultimately decided to leave behind, and to whom. Mr. Whitfield cleared his throat and resumed reading from where he'd paused, his voice steady and unhurried despite the visible tension now radiating off my mother, who sat rigid in her chair, coat still half-buttoned, her eyes darting between the lawyer's face and the papers in his hands as though she were trying, through sheer force of will, to read ahead and brace herself for whatever was coming. The early sections of the will proceeded exactly as I expected. Small bequests went to a couple of cousins I barely knew, modest sums, sentimental items, nothing that raised eyebrows. A donation was designated for my father's church, an amount that felt fitting for a man who'd apparently found more comfort in religious certainty than in his own daughter's existence. The house, unsurprisingly, went to my mother outright, along with the contents of their joint accounts, exactly the kind of straightforward distribution nobody in that room would have questioned. Then Mr. Whitfield reached a section near the end of the document, and I watched him pause slightly before continuing, the kind of deliberate pause a person makes when they already know the words about to leave their mouth are going to detonate something in the room. To my daughter, he read aloud, and my entire body went still, because I hadn't heard that specific word applied to me by anyone connected to my father in 15 years. I leave the remainder of my private investment account, valued as of the date of this will at approximately $840,000, along with my late mother's jewelry collection, currently held in the safety deposit box at Fairview National Bank. The room seemed to tilt slightly around me. I heard my mother make a sharp, strangled sound low in her throat, something caught between a gasp and a word she never managed to finish forming. I sat frozen in my chair, absolutely certain I'd misheard, certain there had to be some other daughter somewhere in this family's history I didn't know about, because the man who'd stood in a doorway 15 years earlier and told me I'd chosen a path he refused to support could not possibly be the same man now leaving me nearly $1 million and his mother's jewelry. Mr. Whitfield, apparently anticipating exactly this confusion rippling through the room, continued before anyone could interrupt him. "This bequest is specifically designated for my daughter," he said, "and I've been asked to read the following personal statement aloud as part of this proceeding." He unfolded a separate sheet of paper, and I realized, with a jolt that ran straight through my chest, that my father had written something meant to be spoken directly to me, in this exact room, after his death, in a way he'd never once managed to do while he was still alive to say it himself. "I know I don't deserve to call her that," Mr. Whitfield read, his voice softening slightly as he relayed my father's words into the silence of the room. 15 years ago, I made a choice I've regretted every single day since, and I was too much of a coward to ever say so to her face while I still had the chance. I let fear and other people's judgment decide who my own child was allowed to be, and I lost her because of it, and no apology now can undo the years that were taken from both of us. This isn't meant to buy forgiveness. I don't expect it, and I don't think I deserve it. It's simply the only thing I have left to give her, and I wanted her to know that despite everything, despite my own failure as her father, she was never actually erased from my heart, even when I was too weak to say so out loud while I was still here to say it. I don't remember exactly what my face did while he read those words aloud. I remember my eyes burning, remember gripping the arms of my chair hard enough that my knuckles ached for an hour afterward, remember feeling something enormous and complicated cracking open somewhere in my chest, not quite forgiveness, not quite relief, something messier and far harder to name, something that held grief for the years we'd lost alongside a strange, unexpected tenderness toward a man I'd spent a decade and a half deliberately trying not to think about at all. My mother, meanwhile, had gone completely white in her chair. "That's not right," she said suddenly, her voice cutting sharply through the stunned quiet of the room. "He wouldn't have done that without telling me first. There has to be some mistake." Mr. Whitfield calmly explained that the will had been updated and formally notarized 8 months earlier, entirely within my father's legal right to do so privately, and that there was no mistake to be found anywhere in the document. It was valid, properly witnessed, and completely unambiguous in its language. My mother's composure cracked further with every single word he spoke, and she turned to face me directly for the first time since walking through that door, her expression twisting rapidly from raw shock into something considerably uglier. "You need to give that money to the family," she said, her voice rising. "That account was supposed to help with my retirement, with repairs on the house, with you don't even talk to us." You haven't in 15 years. You don't deserve. I didn't talk to you, I said, my voice steadier than I expected it to come out, because you and Dad put me out of the house at 13 years old and told me I wasn't your daughter anymore. I didn't disappear from this family, Mom. I was removed from it,